Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. Welcome to the next in this series that I'm calling Hawker's Stormbirds, because they all are named after stormy weather phenomena. Firstly, there was the beautiful alliteration of the Hawker Hurricane, but then, continuing to name the aircraft after storms just lends this feeling of swirling wind and furious power to all of them. The tornado, the tempest, and finally to one of my all-time favorites, the typhoon. Back in 1937, just as production was starting on the Hurricane, Sidney Camm had already began working on the replacement for it. The Hurricane was always going to be a transition aircraft, a kind of hybrid between the older, fabric-covered, steel tube type construction of the biplanes from World War I and interwar eras, and the new all-metal birds of World War II. In July of 1938, the Air Ministry issued Specification F-1837 that was seeking a heavily armed interceptor armed with 12 303 machine guns and capable of at least 400 miles per hour. The new interceptor was to be powered by either the Napier Sabre or the Rolls-Royce Vulture, two newly developed super engines that were to produce 2,000 horsepower. Hawker decided then to create two aircraft, one based on each type of engine. The Rolls-Royce Vulture-powered machine was to be called the Tornado, and the Napier Sabre version was to be called the Typhoon. Old-fashioned fabric-covered steel tube construction was to be out, and the entire aircraft was to be skinned in duraluminum. Special care was taken in designing large, easily removed duraluminum panels for maintenance on the engine, hydraulic, and electrical equipment. Another innovation was the use of a car door style access to the cockpit, complete with roll-down windows. The same sort of thing was used on the Bell Airacobra over in the USA. The wing was designed with a slight anhedral at the root, then sweeping slightly upwards with a 5-degree dihedral. The wing was made very strong, with plans for it to be able to support serious armament. The wings also contained the fuel, organized into a 40-gallon main tank outside of the main gear bay, and there was a nose tank in the leading edge of the wing that contained 37 gallons. Prototype Typhoon P-5212 was ready for flight in February 1940. There had been delays due to the Napier Sabre, which as an engine was a problem child, and let's look into why. It was to be expected as Napier was trying to make a pretty vast leap in power output with this engine. Typical big engines of the time produced about 1,200 horsepower, and Napier was calling for 2,000 horsepower and beyond with this beast. The Sabre was an H-block engine. An H is two banks of 12 horizontally opposed cylinders, one placed above the other and geared to a common output shaft. The Sabre was also a sleeve valve engine, which used sliding sleeves instead of poppet valves. These would slide up and down in conjunction with the motion of the cylinder to cover and uncover the ports to affect the firing sequence. It was felt that the sleeve valve system would allow the engine to breathe better, achieving higher RPMs, and thus produce more of that aimed-for power from a smaller package. In testing, the Sabre was earning high marks. In January 1938, experimental Sabres on the test bench started at producing 1,350 horsepower. 2 months later, they were cranking out 2,050. And by 1939, they were generating a whopping 2,400 horsepower compared to the Rolls-Royce Merlin of the time, which produced only about 1,000 horsepower. It looked like Napier had a winner, and the Typhoon would be a beast for it, basically having one engine that was doing the job of two. The problem was that these test engines were, to use modern advertising language, lovingly handmade, small-batch, artisanal products. And when Napier tried to scale this production up to the needs of wartime, well, that's when the poop hit the fan. The sleeve valves were tricky to make, and when regular assembly lines tried to do it, things didn't always work out. And when things didn't work out, cylinders seized, and engines failed. If you enjoyed this video, please do your part and become a member of the channel or drop me a super thanks. If you can't do either of those, then please just like and subscribe and hit the bell. It's really appreciated. But let's get back to the aircraft. The prototype P-5212 made its first flight in February 1940, piloted by Hawker's chief test pilot, Philip Lucas. In May, he had a bit of a scare when, while flying, the joint between the forward fuselage and rear fuselage, which was located just behind his seat, failed. He could actually see daylight coming through the cracks. Bailing out would have been a perfectly reasonable and acceptable response to this disconcerting situation. But Lucas decided to stay with the ship and bring it home. Even though if the joint had fully failed during the landing, it surely would have meant his death. If you're thinking, geez, they should have given him a medal for that, well, they did. He was awarded the George Medal, which was given to civilians for acts of great bravery. In May, the Minister of Aircraft Production ordered that resources from other projects needed to be shifted to the urgent production of Hurricane fighters, plus Bomber Command bombers. The Typhoon was pushed to the back burner, and it took a whole other year before the second prototype took to the air in May of 41. This one was armed with 4 Hispano Mark II 20mm cannon with 140 rounds per gun. Finally, the Air Ministry issued a contract to go ahead with production of 250 of the machines. In May 1941, the first production Typhoon rolled out of the factory and took to the skies. Often in this channel, by the time the aircraft hits the operational history phase, things are pretty smooth sailing. Well, the Typhoon is an interesting Warbird story that didn't take a straight line pathway to success. In August 1941, a new Luftwaffe aircraft had arrived on the scene. In the beginning, the Allied pilots who took it on didn't quite know what they were up against. Some even thought that this new radial engine fighter might be Curtiss P-36 Mohawks that the Luftwaffe had lifted from the French and repainted in their own colors. But this new fighter was no Mohawk. This was the FW-190. It was definitely superior to the Hurricane and even rivaled the Spitfires of the time. The FW-190 had the Spitfire beat in terms of rate of roll and pure straight-line speed at low altitude. The 190, known as the Butcherbird, also outgunned the Spitfire in terms of firepower. With the aid of the 190, the Luftwaffe gained air superiority over the Channel Front. Who was afraid of the big bad Wolf? Well, as it turns out, the RAF was. To answer the threat of the Butcherbird, the Typhoon was quickly pressed into service with No. 56 and 609 squadrons in September of 1941. Literally 1 month after the first production models were coming out of the factories. That's not a lot of time to work out any issues. And as it turned out, the Typhoon had issues. The first basic problem was that the Typhoon had the unhealthy habit of gassing its pilots. Carbon monoxide gas is the result of incomplete combustion, and it was somehow getting into Typhoon cockpits from the big Sabre engine up front. Symptoms of CO poisoning are headache, dizziness, weakness, vomiting, chest pain, and confusion, and eventually loss of consciousness, seizure, and death. Not a helpful situation to be in while trying to fly and fight. In November 1941, modifications were introduced to combat the problem by lengthening the exhaust stubs in order to get the poisonous gases away from the aircraft, and by better sealing the cockpit door. This helped, but to fully solve the problem, the usual practice for Typhoon pilots was to be on oxygen from engine startup to shutdown. In addition to trying to gas its pilots, the pesky Typhoons were also trying to roast them. Cockpit temperatures were uncomfortably high, and so again, modifications were made to increase ventilation in and out of the cockpit. These problems probably wouldn't have been biggies if there had been time to work out the glitches, But it wasn't test pilots discovering them, it was combat pilots trying to fight at the same time as troubleshoot. And these weren't the worst problems. The Typhoon had the very annoying habit of losing its tail. Initial accidents in the operational units were deemed to be pilot error. But in August 1942, one of Hawker's test pilots, Ken Seth Smith, was performing straight and level speed tests, and the aircraft dramatically broke up in flight, killing the pilot. This clearly wasn't pilot error, and Sidney Camm and the team rolled up their sleeves to troubleshoot the problem. They redesigned the mass balance bracket and strengthened the weak areas of the tail with steel straps, and later riveted fish plates, and eventually, in 1944, redesigned the entire empennage, or the tail section. It is thought that about 23 pilots were killed due to tail failures during the Typhoon's operational life. Another thing that required a lot of tinkering was the car door style access to the cockpit. Almost the first 100 examples of the Typhoon had it, but it and the equipment and other stuff behind the pilot caused trouble and poor visibility. There were several interim tries at improving this, but it took until late 1943 to start using a clear, one-piece, sliding bubble canopy. This had slim framing and a cut-down rear dorsal fairing, giving an excellent 360-degree field of view for the pilot. Okay, so that's it, right? How many problems could this airplane have and not get tossed on the scrap heap? Well, there was the finicky Sabre engine to deal with. Its sleeve valves tended to wear quickly, which would cause a spike in oil consumption. What made this problem worse was the dusty conditions that would later be encountered in forward operating airfields. This abrasive dust was literally sandblasting the inside of the cylinders, causing engine failure after as little as 3 flights. Emergency dust filters were designed and sent out, but the first ones would be blown off like a mortar shell if the engine backfired. So another filter with an overpressure door was later fitted to prevent this problem. The Sabre did not like being started in the cold, which caused ground crews to have to start and ground run the engines every 2 hours in cold weather to keep the engine and its oil supply warm. Another problem was that the Typhoon looked a heck of a lot like the plane it was supposed to be killing, the FW-190, resulting in friendly fire situations with Allied gunners and other pilots. The solution was to paint black and white stripes under the wings. Sound familiar? Yes. The idea, later known as invasion stripes, was spread to most Allied aircraft in time for D-Day. Gosh, with all of these problems, was it even possible for the Typhoon to be successful? Well, yes. In late 1942 and early 1943, the Luftwaffe was employing FW-190s and other types as Jagdbombers, or fighter bombers. These intruders would sweep in low across the channel, hot and fast, and hit shipping and ports in southeast England. The RAF found itself almost powerless to stop these high-speed, low-altitude, below-the-radar attacks. As soon as RAF fighters were scrambled to intercept them, the intruders were already gone. Typhoons were called upon to counter this threat. Squadrons would have some of their Typhoons on standing airborne patrols over the coast, while others sitting on the tarmac ready to take off within 2 minutes during the day. With practice, the Typhoons began to shine in this role, knocking down 20 or so intruders in 42 and 43. With the newer Spitfires arriving on the scene, better able to take on the role of pure fighter and interceptor, the Typhoon was retasked to the role for which it would really be remembered: ground attack. The powerful Sabre engine and the strong wing of the Typhoon allowed for it to haul extra fuel drop tanks, bombs, cannon shells, and rockets into the air, and then use them to rain hell upon ground targets. Although the weapon systems were able to handle both bombs and rockets, some squadrons specialized in one or the other, which simplified logistics, and also allowed that squadron to become expert in delivering that particular type of weapon. The rockets certainly required skill and expertise. The RP-3 rockets, also known as 3-inch or 60-pound rockets, were completely unguided, and there was no special sight or system to launch them. The pilot would have to approach the target fully stabilized without slip, yaw, and with a constant speed, all of which could throw off the aim. He would then use his standard reflector gun sight to eyeball the target, account for a ballistic drop of the rockets, and then let fly. The fins at the back of the rocket were canted in order to spin stabilize as the cordite rocket fuel flung the 3-inch tubes at between 1,200 to 750 feet per second, and on the nose was a 60-pound TNT RDX Amatol warhead. Typhoons could carry 4 rockets under each wing, and some were adapted to carry 8. By D-Day, Tiffys were a terrifying juggernaut to the regular Wehrmacht grunt on the ground. Typhoons from 27 different squadrons could be stacked up behind the lines, circling around until called up by radio-equipped RAF operators on the line to bring in the bombs, rockets, and cannon. To the German units on the ground facing this, it must have been hella demoralizing to have your position marked by a smoke shell, and then have wave after wave of fighter bombers come in to just grind you down. What did it matter if the first salvo of 40-pound rockets missed? You knew that there was another coming right after. Many vehicle crews bailed out of their death traps and ran instead. Horst Weber, an SS Panzergrenadier serving with Kampfgruppe Knaust, wrote that, open quotes, "We had 4 Tiger tanks and 3 Panther tanks. We were convinced that we would gain another victory here, and we would smash the enemy forces. But then, Typhoons dropped these rockets on our tanks and shot all 7 to bits. And we cried. We would see 2 black dots in the sky, and that always meant rockets. And the rockets would hit the tanks, which would burn. The soldiers would come out, all burned and screaming with pain." Close quotes. None other than General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, said, open quotes, "The chief credit in smashing the enemy's spearhead, however, must go to the rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. The result of the strafing was that the enemy attack was effectively brought to a halt, and a threat was turned into a great victory." Close quotes. Typhoons were not just being used as a bludgeon, they were also being used as a scalpel to take out individual headquarters when intelligence was gleaned that there were high-value targets within. On the 24th of October 1944, Typhoons hit a building in Dordrecht, where a meeting of senior officials of the German 15th Army was occurring. 32 high-ranking officers were killed, basically decapitating the leadership of the 15th Army. Operation Varsity, which was the Allied crossing of the Rhine River, employed 400 Typhoons, raining death from above on AA guns and other positions as the gliders and paratroopers dropped in. You'd think that there would be more survivors of the Typhoon. 3,317 of them were built, and they were operated by Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and of course the United Kingdom. They were held in very high esteem, especially for the GIs and Tommies and Canuck infantry who were able to call in these killer angels from behind to get them out of scrapes and soften up positions prior to getting up and attacking them from the ground. But only one complete Tiffy exists. Not to besmirch her reputation, but serial number MN235 has gotten around. It was originally at the National Air and Space Museum in the US, then was sent to the RAF Museum in Hendon, North London for a time, and then headed back across the Atlantic to my own nearby Aviation Museum in Ottawa for a visit, and is now back at the Royal Air Force Museum, London. My own daughter Megan, during her school trip to the D-Day beaches, took a picture of the rocket-laden Typhoon replica hanging from the ceiling at the Mémorial de Caen, Normandy. She figured I'd be interested, and I guess my daughter knows me well. So, why do so few exist? Well, one reason is that Typhoons were quickly retired and their squadrons rapidly disbanded after VE Day. But why was this fully developed weapons system so quickly tossed in the dustbin? As Yoda said to Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, there is another. Hawker never gave up tinkering with and improving the Tiffy. There were a dizzying number of updates, and eventually someone had to ask the philosophical question, after you've changed so much, when is it no longer a Typhoon? At some point, they began calling the greatly evolved airplane a Typhoon 2, and then it finally got its own name, the Tempest, and that will be the next video in this series. If you enjoyed this video, please do your part to become a member of the channel or drop me a super thanks. If you can't do either of those, then please just like and subscribe and hit the bell. It's really appreciated. Until next time.